Welcome to the 1871 podcast, and as well as a look back at the draw against Burnley and a look ahead to the game against Luton, we'll also be talking to our special guest tonight, former Reading FC director Graham Denton. And among the other topics we're going to be discussing with Graham, Graham will be talking to us about how he helped Sir John Madejski when he bought the club, and also his involvement in Reading's move from Elm Park to the Madejski Stadium, among plenty of other topics as well. And we've got Dylan Kerr with us, and he's fresh from taking Marumo Gallants out of the South African Premier Division relegation zone. So well done to Dylan. And just wanted to mention something that I did at the weekend. I went to see Brian McDermott do his presentation on his recovery from addiction. So Russell Brown was hosting that. Russell and Brian McDermott know each other very well. So Russell Brown was the host. Brian McDermott was doing his presentation on his recovery from addiction, and it was absolutely brilliant. So if you get an opportunity to see that, it's well worth going. And there's lots of stuff in there about Reading as well. So fantastic evening with Brian. I had a quick chat with him afterwards as well. So before we talk to Dylan and Graham, I'd like to have a chat with you, Johnny, with our co-host, about Saturday's 0-0 draw against Burnley. And Johnny, I think personally there were three reasons to be cheerful on Saturday. So obviously we managed to draw against the champions-elect. Yeah. Other results went our way, and we stopped them from breaking the 106 record. They've got to win all their games to equal it. 5 games left. And a fourth reason, and possibly the most important one, is that there did seem to be a renewed positivity from the team in what was Noel Hunt's first game in charge. Is that kind of how you see it as well, Johnny?
Well, the most important thing, there's a Hunt in charge of Reading. I mean, that goes without saying, doesn't it? Let's be honest. Yeah. But like, I wasn't at the game, but I watched, and totally different to Ince in every aspect. Yeah, Burnley were obviously a top team, but didn't let them really play. Yeah, they had a lot of possession. Their right winger was very good, but Nesta Guinness-Walker did really well against him. They had one clear chance, which is pretty amazing. And it was just that the spirit was there. Ince's Huntley's leadership, you could see it, the impact he's already had in a few days with the players, because they were up for it. The change of formation to 4-4-2, old-fashioned one that worked as well, and gave us a bit of width. And what we've said for a while, he trusted the young players. He trusted the young players to start, and then he had the young players to come on as well. And they all knew what their role was, and they were comfortable doing it. And it shows you what you can do, as we've said, with the same, like we said about Warnock with the players at Huddersfield. Huntley's done that with the players at Reading. He's transformed. We're not getting carried away on one game, but I don't think apart from winning it, I don't think anyone could have thought it could have gone any better for so many different reasons. And that's a positive start for the big game coming up against Luton.
Yeah, and it's just one point now separating Huddersfield, QPR, Cardiff, and Reading. And Dylan, you want to come in on what Johnny's just said, do you? Dylan?
What have you seen?
Oh, we can't
get some young blood in there.
We'll come back to you. So there's just one point separating Huddersfield, QPR, Cardiff, and Reading now, Johnny. And after Wednesday's game against Luton, Reading will have just 3 games remaining. So I think it's fair to say that what you said about Saturday's game, that there's now more optimism that we can actually stay in the Championship now, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you look at it's just his attitude, and even talking about what it meant to him being there. I think you're talking about with the empty stand and just getting the atmosphere in for himself and believing that he's running the club. And whatever happens, that he's doing it for the club, and he's going to do his utmost best to make it work. And I think everyone sees that in him, and everyone believes in what he's doing. And the players look like they're refreshed from what everybody's telling them in the changing rooms. And you know, you look at it, go, we've got a chance now. We have really got a chance, because the other teams be going, geez, they just got a point against Burnley on our first clean sheet in 20 games, I think it was. And you know, you know, stopping the record as well is brilliant. The crowd was brilliant, you know, and that's what we've got to repeat on Wednesday. It probably won't be as big a crowd, but we need to get that going again. Get that positive. You know, I'm sure, you know, we'll have more opportunities to score on Wednesday, even though Luton's a tough team, so he won't be underestimating them. He'll have a game plan, but everyone will go for it. And also now Bournemouth's basically kind of come out and say that he hopes Reading get relegated. I'd stick that on the change room wall and say, let's get it into him and prove him wrong, you know, and let's send Huddersfield down, you know. And he said, I think, you know, his attitude is, we're hunting after teams now. You know, hunt, you know, so it's a real positive mindset of let's go out and do it, rather than it's always, oh, let's hope for a draw. That's negative. And Huntley's come out and go, this is a new way. It's brilliant.
Yeah. Before we bring Dylan and Graham in, just wanted to ask you finally, Johnny, the game against Luton on Wednesday, are we looking for more of the same that we saw from Reading against Burnley, against Luton?
Yeah, you're certainly looking for the same application, the same organisation, the same approach. Probably the one thing you're looking for now is a little bit more goal threat, a little bit more chance to create opportunities, you know, and I think he will set that up, whatever he does, whether it's, you know, we're obviously limited with the choices, but maybe Mate might be there as availability. He might change things up front with, you know, Carroll. Jow played very well on Saturday. You know, the players that haven't looked good, he's installed sort of some spirit back into them. And I don't think Luton would be looking forward to coming to playing against us, you know, to be honest. And I think that's probably the first time in a long time teams now going, hold on, this is a new Reading, you know, and that's a positive thing that Hunt's done already. And, you know, not getting carried away that he's going to win the next 4 games, but it'd be nice if he did. But game at a time, let's go for it on Wednesday and see where we land after that. You know, we're in it now. You know, that's the best thing.
Yeah, so time now for a quick chat with Dylan. And Dylan, sorry, we couldn't really, I think there was a connection issue there, but hopefully we can hear you now. I just wanted to talk to you about Marumo Gallants, because obviously you took over back in January. Marumo Gallants, bottom of the South African Premier Division. They're unbeaten in the league since your arrival, and they're now clear of the relegation zone, and you've got another game coming up on Wednesday. If you are there, Dylan, and you can hear us and the connection's okay, you must be feeling confident that Marumo Gallants can stay up now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. No, we got 3 great points against Chippy United, who have been.
Oh, we're losing.
I was
losing you, Dylan. Oh, go on.
Listen, I'll go down. I'm going to go downstairs because the network might be better downstairs.
Yeah,
give me a minute.
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, while we're waiting for Dylan to come back, let's introduce our special guest for this evening, who's been waiting patiently. Former Royals director Graham Denton. So, welcome, Graham, to the 1871 podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
So, Graham, you started off as a Reading fan. You became a club patron, and then I think I'm right in saying that you actually were considering buying the club before Sir John Madejski took over. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't want to take anything away from what John's done. So originally, as a kid, I was a supporter and went to as many games as I could when I wasn't playing. Even used to walk home sometimes because I spent my bus fare on a programme or something in the club shop. So lived out of Burfield Common, so it was a fair step. And then I got re-involved actually through, not directly through John, but John had a box through his company Auto Trader, and his co-owner of the Auto Trader, Paul Gibbons, invited me a couple of times into their box, and I then went to some box launch for the next phase. I mean, I will tell the full story because it's quite interesting, I suppose, in a sense. It sort of shows where Reading were as opposed to where they are these days. You know, Mike Lewis I met at that occasion, and he somehow managed to persuade me to become a box holder of the new boxes, on top of which I used to own a construction group, and which I sold in 2004. And we built the boxes, and I never got, as I recall, certainly some of my the money that was owed to me was repaid by taking a box. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have got all the money I was owed. That's just how it was back then. And so we were box holders for a number of years. Then they launched the patrons, and initially it was 12 invited local businessmen, and there were various characters and business people from around the town back then. I was fortunate to be one of them, and by some way the youngest, because I was still in my 20s, I think, when I first got invited. And Roger Smee asked me to look after the ground for him and run something called the grounds committee, which I was fortunate enough to have a guy called George Marshall, who was not only a great man, he was also a great supporter of Reading Football Club, and was a supporter up to the day he sadly died. And he was also managing director of a company called Collier and Catley, which I subsequently bought, which was brought about by my involvement as the chairman of the grounds committee. So, that was quite an interesting sort of backstory, if you like. And, things developed from there. And there was also another wonderful character who was also a patron, so was George, called Frank Orton, who Frank Orton's family had the covenant on the old Elm Park, and Frank was the life president up until the time that he sadly passed away. But he was another guy that went to most of the all of the home games and the majority of the away games, and was still driving well into his 80s up and down the motorways of Great Britain to go and support Reading, as he did back in those days. He's also a great cricket supporter, Frank. So yeah, that led to me being quite close to things. And when the club was in trouble at the end of 1990, I looked at it with my finance director at the time. We were struggling to get information out of the directors at the time. They just really wanted someone to come in and sort of take it over. I knew John. I spoke to John, and John said what he was prepared to do. And I said, okay, I'll stand in the way. And when you're ready, give me a shout, and I'll come in and help you roll my sleeves up and get the job done. There was actually, I was trying to find it before tonight's podcast, but I couldn't lay my hands on it. But there was a runners and riders sort of forecast on the front of the Evening Post back in the day. And it had sort of, I think John was either first or second. I think John Knight was also in there as one of the odds. And I was in there twice. I was in there as as Graham Denton, but I'd never speak to the press because they never really reported it as I felt they should. And then there was also a consortium which I was also involved in, and it was a number of people involved in the club. But John was clearly the right man to do it. He was, he was prepared to do it. He was financially in the place that he could deal with it. I think that it probably was a greater challenge than he originally thought, but we got it under control quite quickly. So I think he took it over on one day. The next day he and I met for lunch, and the process started from there. So I'd like to think that John would agree that I went in and did a lot of the hard work in the background. He certainly provided the cash. There's no question about that. He's got a lot. People have got a lot to thank him for, because he's obviously left it in a much happier place than he found it. And it's cost him a lot of money in the process. So, but that's a matter for him to discuss, not for me. The only other thing I would say on it is that I am proud to say that I think at least 4 of the 6 years I was involved, we managed to break even or make a little bit of money. There were a couple of years where that wasn't possible, mainly through things that had already been put in place that we couldn't do much about. It's certainly in the first year. It was a bit of a mess, but we got it under control. I think things started to, and obviously we could then look to things like the new stadium. And I'd like to think, although I can't claim to have helped take it to small meat as it was known in those days, I can claim my part in negotiating the deal with Reading Borough Council, being involved in all those key negotiations, along with John. It was John and myself, along with all the senior officers. And I have to say, in credit to Reading Borough Council at the time, they were very supportive, determined. We had a chief executive, head of legal services, head of highways, head of planning, leader, deputy leader. I'd have to say they all played their part, and they were all superb in helping John and I achieve the dream and getting the planning consent, both there and at Elm Park. There was a great willingness to do it and a great desire. John obviously took it on after I left and took it to the point of delivery. But I would say, I mentioned a chap earlier called George Marshall, and my stepping down at the football club, it coincided with George's retirement. George was managing director at Colin Lee, and he, as I said earlier, he was a great man, and he went in and helped oversee the project for the football club. So I felt a connection, and certainly George used to keep me posted as to how things were going and how the little things that mattered to me, things like giving decent knee room between seats and things like that. George tried to make sure those little details that I was keen to see were delivered within the design of the stadium, and I think it's fair to say that was, along with a number of other small things. But yeah, I wouldn't want to take anything away from Sir John or anybody else that was involved in that final process, because I was certainly involved in the planning and negotiations with Reading Borough. But when I decided to stand down, I obviously stood away from that.
Well, we're going to bring in Dylan and then Johnny. So I'll come to Dylan. Firstly, Dylan, let's test the connection. Are you with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, brilliant. Loud and clear. Well, listen, over to you, because I know that you know Graham really well. So obviously fire away with a couple of questions to Graham, and then we'll bring Johnny in after that.
No, honestly, I mean, I'm absolutely delighted that Graham's not only doing this, but actually it's the first time I've seen him since I left Reading. And, he was part with Sir John and obviously Mike Lewis in bringing me down to Reading. And I can't thank him enough for that, because, what a great experience I've had and I'm still having. And Graham was probably the man in the small bar for the directors' lounge that I often frequented, because I'd get many man of the matches, and I'd been there, and he introduced me to a lot of people, especially two famous Yorkshire people, Jane and Graham, who I ended up living with when I was at Reading. But it's brilliant to actually see him. He's looking brilliant. He's still as exciting as ever. Not. But I'm glad he's still got his hair, which is even a bonus. But Graham, when obviously I joined in 1993, we had that small office under the stadium. I think there was Mike Lewis. I think that Jane Rabbit. There was another secretary. I can't remember her name, but she was a little girl, a little toty girl. Then obviously there was Jackie came. And I think the then secretary was Nigel. I think it was called Nigel.
No, the secretary at the club at the time. I think there was a guy that was not there very long, but Andrea was the club secretary. Andrea was the club secretary. There was no Nigel there until after I left. Jane might have been there briefly. There was another Jane before Andrea. There were two Janes as well, and then there was Eileen and Sue in the accounts.
Yeah, there was Brian.
Brian, yeah. Well, I appointed Brian. He's the one thing that's still there, of course.
He is still there. But I mean, we've spoken on this quite a lot of times. We as players and as a squad, we had a family atmosphere. We belonged to the supporters. We belonged to Reading, not just the football club, but to the town. I mean, when you went into it with Sir John, I mean, what was your initial thinking? You wanted to buy it, obviously, and you're in the consortium, as you said. But when you actually took over Reading, I mean, how was that feeling? What was your optimism, and what was your thoughts of how the club were going to go, where they were going to go?
Well, I think the first thing was to sort of get underneath it all. I didn't play at a professional level, but I played a fair bit of football myself, and it was always my passion. And I'd been involved in the club, in the background for some time. So really, the idea was to try and get an understanding of the problems, and there were some problems. I remember the first player we signed. I don't know if he was still there when you arrived. Danny Bailey was the first player we signed from Exeter City. I saw Danny actually at a youth game that I went to where my son was on trial some years ago. He hadn't changed. And then, I guess Ian Porterfield was manager. And, again, I wouldn't want to talk disrespectfully about Ian. He did do a fair job, but there came a time where it was necessary for a change. And Eddie, who's back at the club now, stayed for a short while, but was very loyal to Ian and wouldn't be considered for the job. So we had to go out and look for a new manager. And at the time, the press were always watching the club for any leaks or stories, and they knew where John lived. They didn't know much about me, so we did all the interviews at my house. And we saw, I don't know, 8 or 10 managers, some experience, some not so experienced, some experienced, including Mark. And Mark was the standout. And Mark turned up in this sponsored car with Newcastle United all over the side of it, because he was still a player for them officially at the time. And we had to hide it in front of one of my garages and park a couple of cars around it, because we still had a couple of interviews to do. And I took him to the French Horn, booked him into the French Horn in my name, and just said to Michael, look, don't ask any questions. We'll be back later tonight. And book us a table for dinner for 4 or 5 people. And that's how it happened back then. And we appointed Mark, and that was the start of the journey, really. Mark, in fairness, brought Colin in, and I saw Colin's podcast recently. Colin, and both of them were prepared to come in for no money. I mean, we didn't pay Mark very much when he came, and Colin even less. And, we put some incentives in place where, they got some money if the crowds went up and those sorts of things, but it all started to happen. And I always remember when I first got involved and started going to boardrooms, other directors would say to me, every manager you employ, they'll all want 2 more players. And when you get them those 2 more players, they want 2 more, but they won't want to let anyone go because of this, that, and the other. And that really proved to be the point. But in Mark's case, Mark and I are the same age. We became good mates. We went on holiday together a couple of times. And I'd go to games with him on a Tuesday night and watch a player if he wanted me to support him in terms of making a case to the chairman and so on. Obviously, John had always had the final say. But, there are some amusing moments, because I remember on one occasion, the final piece of the jigsaw was Quinny. And Quinny was at Bournemouth at the time. John had to go abroad, I think, on business. And John said to me, look, get him for 50. Mark had said, I reckon we can get him for 50 or 60,000. So, of course, John latches onto the 50, which is understandable. So John says, you can go to 50,000. So anyway, Mark and Tony Poulis, who was the Bournemouth manager at the time, they tried to do a deal, didn't happen. So eventually I get dragged into it and have to speak to their chairman. I can't remember his name now, Hayward, I think his name was. And eventually we do a deal, I think 50 grand straight in and 5 grand after so many games. And John comes back and he gives me a right telling off and said, I told you 50 grand. What are you doing about it? Where's the other 5 grand coming from? I said, well, and you think about the way money's thrown around today. So the last 3 bits of our jigsaw was Quinny was the final piece, but I think Simon Osborne was one of them. And there was one other person. It might have been Paul Olsgrove. I can't remember if it was him or somebody else now. But I mean, I think, we had some spectacular signings, and I remember when we signed Darius Vodovcek, who I think's one of the best centre halves ever to play for Reading, other than perhaps Adi, just in case he's watching. But I think Darius was just a player that read the game. He's very intelligent. He wasn't the biggest centre half, but he could read it, pick the ball out there, and find a player to start a move off. And I remember we signed Darius in Villa Marina in Henley, which is still there. Mark, myself, Raymond Sparks, who was Darius's agent, and our wives. It was after we played the Spanish team in a friendly. Darius played in that for us, but we managed to get him, and I thought that was some coup on Mark's behalf, and obviously must have been partly due to his relationship with Raymond Sparks, the Scottish agent that brought him down. But I think pretty much every signing Mark made, made a difference, and gelled with the backbone of the local lads, the Adi Williams, the Scotty Taylors, Archie Lovels, and I can remember back in the day, Archie Lovell, when he first started playing in the first team, didn't even have a car. I used to drop him off home in Caversham Park Village on my way home, so I lived in Sonning in those days. I don't know if you were on the bus that day where we played Brentford away, and I'd had a function at my house the previous weekend and said, look, boys, you want to come back for a few beers? There's some beer left. Let's, and I know Ray Ranson and a few others came back at the time. And, we ended up in the chairman's limo, taking you all down the French Horn, and the chairman didn't look too comfortable with that and soon moved you off down into the town to one of the more appropriate bars. But in those days, those trips on the team bus, they were special. You wouldn't be allowed to do it today, but I remember coming back on one team bus from somewhere up north, and can't remember exactly which one it was. We loaded the beer up with beer, but it was a long old trek wherever it was, probably somewhere like Grimsby. We came off the motorway at Birmingham and found another off license to top up with beer. Well, that wouldn't happen today, but it all made that team spirit that much greater. And I on the way to a game, I never interfered, but coming back, I was sat with the lads watching the videos, playing cards, even arm wrestling and all the silly things that went on a team bus up and down the motorways. And they were some fantastic times. And, I was only in my early 30s, so I wasn't much older than most of them and a similar age to one or two. And they were special times. I always thought that, but that, I think there was only one person that was more miserable than me, and that was Kevin Dillon.
Graham, I just want to, I know Dylan's probably got a few more questions to ask you, but I'm conscious of the fact that Johnny's been sitting there waiting to ask his questions. So, Johnny, go on, jump in, and then...
No, it's just enjoyable listening to you.
Resume their chat.
It's just lovely listening to you both. And Graham, I just ask you, what's your I guess I don't want to go on for you too long, but 3 of your own personal highlights and memories for you being involved in that time, which was a huge sort of part of our club.
I think the first most memorable time was when we won the championship, and that promotion year, 94. When then obviously that team went on to almost get us into the Premiership, and the only year where 2 teams didn't go up and had to go into the playoffs in second place. So, I mean, I could talk about that for hours, because I think there are a couple of games, particularly the Port Vale game at home, where if we'd have won that instead of drawing it, we would, we'd have automatically gone up. But there we are. It wasn't to be. I guess my next one is that playoff. I mean, whilst it's gutting to go to Wembley and then not actually achieve that dream, it was a pretty special achievement. And so that's my second. My third is, I think I can't actually miss it out. I don't think is we played just in the January before I left the club. We played Man United in the FA Cup, and it was one of only 2 games in the whole country that got played that day. And we'd hired the pitch covers from Wembley. I knew the groundsman there, a guy called Steve Tingley, and so I sent one of my lorries up to collect the ground covers. We covered the pitch before all the bad weather came. We got the game on, and I always remember ringing Man United and speaking to the club secretary and saying that we've agreed this. We got pitch inspection at 8:30 on Saturday. If you want to send someone along, obviously, please do. And I agreed to pick Jeff Winter up, and he was, believe this or believe it not, he was staying at the World Turned Upside Down on Basingstoke Road, which was a travel lodge or something similar in those days. I picked him up about 8:10, took him down to the ground, and we walked out through the old tunnel at Elm Park. And there's Alex Ferguson, Ken Merritt, and Fred, the groundsman, out on the pitch. And Alex has come straight over to Jeff Winter and he said, I'm happy to play the game, ref. And Jeff Winter says, I'll make the decisions, Mr. Ferguson, if you don't mind. And then went off with Fred to sort of inspect a few corners of the pitch and the centre circle, and I sort of pull the cover back, have a look. So Jeff Winter agrees the game could go ahead. He doesn't want me to take him back. He's going to find his own way back. And so Alex Ferguson turns to me and says, you better get the chairman on the phone now. I'm going to tell him we got a game on. I'll make the tea, show me where the kettle is. And that's exactly what happened. And then as he left to go back to, they were staying at the Swan at Streatley, he said to me, make sure there's a decent bottle of red wine and we'll have a glass after the game. And he and I shared a bottle of red wine. We were having a conversation about the nonsense that was going on at Newcastle at the time, all these players getting paid crazy money. Alex was saying, what chance have I got with all these youngsters coming in through Giggs, Beckham, Scholes, those sort of players? What's going to happen to this game? So that was the start of, what has now become, the circus we all see today in the sense of the crazy money and the way we've allowed it to get out of control. And on top of that, I think, particularly given the recent events, John Motson came into the boardroom at the end. I'd invited him to come and have a drink after the game. He'd seen me earlier in the day orchestrating people getting things moving so we could get the game played, etc. And it started snowing after everyone had gone, make matters worse. So back in those days, we had a county council, so I got hold of them to grit the roads. I got Reading Borough to grit the footpaths. I got an army of my own guys to come in and grit the 2 open ends so that the terraces were safe for people to stand on. And that's John Watson had witnessed all of this and said he came in, and I'm sure you probably all heard, he does this crib sheet with all the players. I've actually got it in my office of all the players and a few notes against each player. And then he's got a few facts, like Reading played Man United last in the Watney Cup and all that sort of stuff. And he'd signed it to Graham, best wishes, John Watson. So that holds pride of place for me. And that is a very special memory because he was obviously a great man and, sadly lost to us all now. So, yeah, so they're my 3. Brilliant. I mean, I've got lots of them, to be honest. I could probably sit and talk for the rest of the evening on them.
Have you got anything on Dylan while he's here?
Well, the only thing that always makes me smile about Dylan, and Dylan will probably, what goes on tour stays on tour, Dylan, don't worry. But I always remember when we won the championship, the players had come up through the director's box and, we're all sort of embracing and for some reason I kissed Dylan. I don't know why. And Dylan's been interviewed on the radio. He's gone, I just got a kiss off Mr. Denton. so it was a bit of a surreal moment. But I always remember it was on the tape on Radio Berkshire or whoever did the thing. Dill's being interviewed and he's relayed the story about running through the director's box and getting a kiss off of me. But it was a very special day, that one. And so no, I mean, I think Dill was always a character, always very much in the mix and in the middle of everything that went on the team bus or in amongst the players. Obviously, and I know you've talked about this before, and I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but the only time I was ever asked to go to the training ground, I mean, I probably went once or twice others, but Mark McGee rang me up one day and said, we've got a real problem. And it was the Scotty Taylor, Jimmy Quinn incident that you're all very familiar with. So I'm not going to go into it. And Mark was saying, well, the players don't want him to play again. And blah, 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 they don't want him in the team anymore. And I said, come on, Mark, he scored 20 odd goals or something, and it's only halfway through the season. We got to get some sense into all of this. Anyway, I sat Quinny in one room and Scotty in the other. Quinny was full of, remorse and was sorry, and it was one of those flash in the pan moments. Scotty was not that bothered, but was more interested in what he might get out of it. And I won't go into the detail, but there was a financial settlement, shall we say? And I think, Quinny and Scotty shook hands. That was the end of the matter, and Scotty went and lost it at the casino that night, I think. So that was the sort of stories that I enjoyed. I enjoyed sorting those, but not all the problems they created for me. Not necessarily all of the problems, but most of them. And I had a great rapport with the players. I always got on well, with people like, AD, Dylan, Phil Parkinson, Jilksy, was always a player that I had to spend a bit of time with, but, in a positive way. He always trusted me. I think he'd been let down by previous people within the club. But it's great to see him still involved. It's great to see him succeeding there. He deserves it, so I'm pleased about that. But there were lots. Shaka was another one. He was a great character. I must admit, when Mark first brought him over, I needed to convince him. But I got a great story about that, actually, because we sold... We didn't necessarily want to, but Steve Francis signed for Huddersfield for when Neil Warnock was manager. So Mike Lewis and I and Mark McGee, we go up to the tribunal because Warnock offered us 25 grand and we asked for 250. And anyway, we go in and out of the tribunal, and at the end, you all go back. You go in individually, Reading and Huddersfield, and you make your case, and then you get called back, and you all go in together, and then they make the case for who's what the decision is. Anyway, they awarded us something like 175,000, and I think we were playing Huddersfield quite early in the season. If it wasn't that following weekend, it was the one after. And as we're going down the staircase, Neil Warnock's walking down with Steve Francis. Mark, Mike, and I are walking behind, and all we could hear is Neil Warnock saying, "Oh, I wouldn't have effing signed you if I've effing known that. That's all my budget got on one effing player." You've got to motivate him in a minute, So there was all those sorts of stories that, So I've never been a Warnock fan after that, I have to say, because I never thought that was the greatest display of man management. But it was, and we went to Huddersfield and won, as I recall.
Yeah, 3-0, wasn't it?
It was the first game of the season.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So Stevie Francis had to be in goal. Yeah, so. It was, Steve was always a bit of a loner. I never had any issues with him, but the lads used to rinse him quite a lot about gnomes, as I recall. I don't know what it was all about. They reckon he had a gnome in his garden or something. But, he was a bit of a loner, but he was a good servant at Reading Football Club. So I've got nothing to add to that one, really.
Graham, what was your role in helping Sir John with the move to the stadium? Because I think it was it more to do with negotiating the deal with Elm Park? Was that?
No, my background's property and construction. So, one of the main things that, I was asked to look at and deal with. And to be fair, there'd been lots of discussions in the past, lots of in fact, I did find that one, which was, and there are lots of others where, I'd been seen going in to see Reading Borough about various things. And, but John had worked quite hard in building a relationship with Reading Borough. I worked quite hard with Reading Borough, and eventually all of the pieces came together, and we had, I'd have to say, Martin Salter, who went on to be a local MP, he was the deputy leader, and he was also a very keen Reading supporter. And I'd have to say, if I was going to single anybody out for praise and credit, Martin had a an unbelievable desire to make that happen. And I think we were very lucky to have him involved in local politics at the time. There was nothing, in it for him. He didn't even claim the credit for it, but he was. We used to meet at 7 o'clock in the morning to get it all done before the rest of the day, so everyone could get on with their business, and also to try and keep it under the radar a bit. And it got to the point where we were meeting 2 or 3 times a week at sometimes to keep the momentum going. And as I say, when I left, there was still some fairly key things still to be resolved. There were some. John and I didn't necessarily agree on how some of those things should be done, but it was his club, and I respected it at the time and still do. One of them was funding, and in the end, I had different thoughts to John, and John ended up putting his hand in his pocket, and fair play to him. I'm not going to disrespect that, because it's how it's happened at the end of the day.
Yeah, and also I just wanted to ask you about Colin Lee, because I heard that. You actually tried to keep Colin Lee.
Yeah, I watched the podcast, and I was a bit disappointed, because the truth of the matter is that I spoke. John and Ian Wood-Smith had been to see Mark, and he had agreed to stay. And I got a phone call from Mark about 1 o'clock in the morning to say he was staying, and we'd have dinner and blah blah blah. And the next morning, I'm driving to the office, and I'm driving into, and the phone goes, it's Mark. And he said, Graham, I'm sorry, I'm off. I said, well, you can't have it. Have you spoken to the chairman? He said, no. I said, well, you can't have this conversation with me. You've got to speak to the chairman. I literally just heard John on BBC Berkshire telling everyone that Mark was staying and how pleased he was, which was fair enough, because that's what we all understood. And so I said to Mike, you got to ring him. And he said, well, I can't get hold of him. So I said, look, you can, and try this number, you'll get it. And anyway, I left it 5 or 10 minutes, and I rang John. I said, have you heard from Mark? And he said, no. So I said, look, you're not going to like this, because I don't like it either. So, but don't go shooting the messenger. Mark just told me he's off, and he's on his way to Leicester. And he said, oh, and quite understandably was not best pleased. And I think they eventually did speak, but I don't think there was a lot of point in the conversation for obvious reasons. Anyway, we met at John's house, John, Ian and myself. We're watching it on TV unfold with Mark, Colin, Mike Itwin, old Kit Caboodle, walking into the Leicester club. And we're sat there thinking, great, we're on this crest of a wave, and now we got this. So we obviously had to talk to the senior pros. So we talked to Quinny and Geordie as the two, senior players, along with Adi as the club captain, and the rest is history, really. And whether, given our time again, we'd have left it as long as we did, I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly as guilty as anybody else for supporting that decision, so I'm not suggesting anything differently. But it was the next morning, I got a phone call about 7:30 at home, and it was Colin Lee. And Colin said to me, Graham, it's Colin, I'm in a hotel room at Leicester. I think I've made a terrible mistake, and I'd like to come back. And I said, well, Colin, you need to speak to the chairman. I mean, it's not automatic that you can come back, but certainly, because of what's happened, certainly you're in a good position. Anyway, I think Colin quite rightly said that we got Ian to read whatever it was he signed, and it wasn't really possible. So, as Colin actually asked to come back, Colin, I've often said that, and Dylan may have a different view to this, Mark and Colin, if they'd have been able to maybe stay at Reading and, take it to the level that I think they could have done, then I think they could have been the next, Clough and Taylor relationship, because Mark was the man manager, Colin was the tactician and coach. Colin, I've never, I go out to dinner with Colin and he'd be getting salt and pepper pots. I love football, but there is a time, and we'd be out with our wives, and he'd be talking through a move, and and all the rest of it. Colin was very intense when it came to the coaching side, but was, I believe, a large part of the success. And I would certainly give him. And he came, as I say, at the time, he came to Reading. I think he was at Watford and just been sacked, or changed because of a change of ownership or something. Anyway, it was all at a time where there was, various things going on in the background. So we were able to get him for not much money, and we were very fortunate, to have had that. And I think Mark, I identified him because they'd been at Bristol City together as youngsters, I think, and they had a very good working relationship. I don't know the details of the ending of that. I don't think, unfortunately, there's a lot of love lost there any longer, sadly. But anyway, that's none of my business.
I think, Graham, from a player's point of view at the time, I think it would have been nice for them to come and actually ask us, in the dressing room, what was going to happen, what was happening. Maybe we could have, because we were on a different level with Colin and Mark. They did work together. They did, it was a unique experience to play under them, because you respected them, and we loved playing for them. We loved the attitude of the gaffer. We loved the attitude of Colin, and we I think we were all shocked. We knew the rumours, but we were all shocked. And then obviously when they went and it didn't work, and then they got poached by Wolves, and then they ended up taking Ozzy, they took Adi, and they took Chelsea. It was like, it's like they dismantled that, niche of players that were vital to what Reading Football Club were all about.
Yeah, well, it is one of those. People have often said to me, do you miss the club? And I say, I miss how it was, but not how I perceive it to be, And I think football has changed, and it's not just Reading, it's football as a whole. Maybe there could have been more consultation, but the trouble was we were dropped in it as much as anybody else. And, we firmly believed that we'd had an agreement that they were staying. And obviously, I think, Mark was at the head of all of that, and he made the decision, and, only he can say whether he's lived to regret it or not. I personally have a view that you can never look back. You always have to look forward. I enjoyed my time with Mark. I'd like to think Mark would still consider me to be a friend. If we met, we'd still have a good laugh and catch up about the old days. And, there were lots of good. And when he was at Brighton, I used to go down there fairly regularly, inviting me to one of their golf days and things. And, he was always a good friend. So, I haven't seen him recently, but that's mainly because he's been there and everywhere, and I think now he's pretty much retired. He's doing a school governor's role. I see you commenting on that the other day, and I liked it. But I'm not sure what else he's doing these days. It's a waste, really, because his man management skills were very good, and he was a good. He was good on his feet. And Mark and I, back in the day, we used to do a number of talks to local business groups, things like Rotary and stuff, talking about the ambition of the football club and where it might go and all the rest of it. And, he was always good to work with and positive in those sort of scenarios, and, represented the club well.
I think, looking back, like you said, looking back at the stories, I think it was our first golf charity golf day when I just joined. I think we played at Sindlesham Mill, is it? I can't remember now, the golf course. I think you introduced me to Stan Bembernick.
Oh, right, yeah.
You're playing with Stan Bembernick, and he was stood behind the car, and he says, "Oh, where's my cart? I need a golf cart." And I went, and I turned around to him and says, "He's lazy. How come he's not walking, the lazy bugger?" Next thing, he hobbles out on one leg. I was like,
Stan was a. Yes, I saw Stan a couple of years ago at a non-league game, and he's a character. He always used to crack me up. In fairness to the guy, he lost his leg, and watching him tee off, where he always made a fair connection, but then he did a sort of couple of 360 turns to sort of recover from it. But, he didn't let his impediment sort of stop him enjoying his life, and still doesn't, And I think a lot of the time he did have a false leg, but he never wore it for golf for whatever. I assume that it didn't work for him on a golf course, but he got on with it, to be fair, and he gave everything he had. He's still around, and still, I think he's more involved in local stuff these days. I saw he was involved with Sandhurst Town or something when I last saw him, as a supporter, I think.
Graham, I've got a question for you about the current side and Noel Hunt. And you mentioned Michael Gilt's still involved in the club. Obviously, Noel, great player for Reading, has come back. What do you think of where the club are now? And obviously, you mentioned Sir John and everything he did for Reading. And now it kind of feels, it does feel as if we're getting through a bit of a kind of a slump, if you like, over the last few years, and we're coming out of that a little bit now. What do you think of the way the club sort of geared up to move forward from here?
To be honest, I'm not as close to it, and I don't go to games. I'll be totally honest with you. I kind of stayed with the club after I resigned. I found it increasingly difficult because I used to get players come and try and drag me into things to get things sorted out, and I'd end up getting into discussions with Sir John that I didn't really want to get into. And so in the end, as a kid, my team was always Chelsea. So I've had season tickets at Chelsea for a number of years, although I've not been going to them since my kids go, but I haven't been going recently, and they've got their own problems at the minute. So I think my current feeling about the club is I think clubs like Reading should be run and managed and owned by local people like Sir John and Roger Smee, Frank Waller, people before Sir John, the local businessmen. But I also know that it's difficult because of the money. One of the other things that was just coming into play as I stood down was agents, and most of the Reading players seem to use a guy called Barry Siltman back in those days, and I think I escorted Barry off the premises on my last meeting with him because there was just no reasoning with him, and at the end of the day, what I couldn't get the players to understand then was the little bit extra he got for them, they were giving to him anyway. So if they'd have been sensible, they could have kept. So I think agents have spoiled it. The whole thing. I always used to say, for every pound we get through the turnstile, we've got to try not to spend more than 95p, absolute maximum 98p. We've got to save some for a rainy day. We can't build in these cup runs. We can't build in. And, to be fair, John was happy to buy into all of that and did for a number of years. Obviously, moving to the new stadium, it required a number of gambles, some of which came off. And listen, he took them to the promised land. He took them to the Premiership. I could never take that away from him. In my small way, I almost helped him achieve it with the playoffs, but we never quite made it, so I can't claim that. So, at the end of the day, I'm sad to see the club in the dilemma it's in, but it's difficult to see how it's going to get out of it with the amount of money they seem to spend over and above what they earn. Now, I have no idea how a person from a totally unrelated country, and he's not the first, obviously, he's the third foreign owner we've had involved, how they can justify throwing these crazy amounts of money at a club that really don't mean much to them. And, you can't be getting any enjoyment from what's been going on since he's owned it. And I find it all quite bizarre. But, it's none of my business, and I wish them well. I certainly hope they manage to pull off the miracle that's needed to see them survive. And I wish Noel Hunt and the rest of the team down there all the best. And I'll watch the results very carefully. I do listen to Adi and Geordie on the radio from time to time. I obviously enjoy catching up with them when I do.
All right, well, that's all we've got time for. So thank you to Dylan, thank you to Johnny, and thank you, of course, to our special guest, Graham Denton. Thanks for joining us, Graham.
All right, thank you, and good luck with the rest of this current series. And Dill, lovely to see you.